Now to introduce our speaker of the day, we have our retired Denver County Judge, Larry Funny Bone Boning.
Thank you, Andre, except I'm not supposed to be funny today. I first met our guest speaker, Mr. David Lively, several years ago when we found out we had a shared interest in the preservation of the Byers Peak Ranch near Fraser, Colorado. It's a ranch where President Dwight D. Eisenhower loved to vacation with his Colorado friends Axel Nielsen and Carl Norgren. And Ike loved to trout fish and paint mountain scenery at the Byers Peak Ranch. But that's a story for another day. Today, Mr. Lively is going to talk about some of the unique history of Rocky Mountain National Park, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. I know nearly all of us have toured Rocky Mountain National Park with friends and relatives to show them some of the most spectacular scenery in Colorado. Mr. Lively, who is president of Historic Fraser, has deep family roots in Colorado, will give us an armchair tour of Rocky Mountain National Park, and in particular, Kawaniuchi Valley, a high mountain valley on the west side of the park. Dave is one of 10,000 certified interpretive guides in the U.S., is a speaker for the Rocky Mountain National Centennial Speaker Series, and conducts history seminars and tours for Rocky Mountain National Park, Rocky Mountain Conservancy, and the Trail River Educational Center. He appears in the 2015 PBS documentary called The Living Dream, A History of the Rocky Mountain National Park. He is Vice Chair and West Slope Representative of Colorado Preservation, Inc., and past president of Grand Lake Area Historical Society. Enjoy the ride, and would you please help me welcome Mr. David Lively.
Thank you, Judge Boning. I am honored to be here and make this presentation for you today. When Judge Boning asked me to come, I didn't even hesitate. I said, of course, I would love to be there and present the history of mostly the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. Rocky Mountain National Park. Just those words. What does that conjure up? Wilderness, wildlife, wonder. What about the people? What about the people that came to what's now Rocky Mountain National Park before it was Rocky Mountain National Park and since Rocky was established? And I'm going to talk about just a few of the different cultures and the people that have come through the Kawaniuchi Valley on the west side of Rocky. As Larry mentioned, I know that most of you probably have been up and over the top of Trail Ridge Road and dropped down into the Kawaniuchi Valley to visit the Grand Lake area. And I'm going to show you some of that area again in a different light, hopefully. Forgive me for turning around. I'm a historian. We're always looking backwards. We've had a number of different cultures that have come through what's now Rocky Mountain National Park, starting thousands of years ago with the Paleo Indians that came up and over the top of what's now Trail Ridge Road, doing the same thing that we do every day. They were looking for food. Bumping forward a number of years, let's say, 4,000 years ago, we had the Clovis Indians doing the same thing, except they lived on the top of the ridges for years and years and years. They created game drives, and the women and children would walk behind the elk and the mountain buffalo and directing them down these game drives where the braves were with their spears and bows and arrows, and they would hunt the same as we do, trying to put food on the table. Well, roughly 400 years ago, the Utes arrived in the area. Again, they came up from what's now the Estes Park area, and they would go up and over the top of the mountain, and they created a series of trails over to that big, beautiful lake and the big valley that they love to camp in for the summertime. The picture that you see is one of their trails. They had a series of them. They had the Dog's Trail and the Child's Trail and the Big Trail. The Child's Trail. Many people ask me about the name of that. You know, well, that must have been the easy trail. Actually, it wasn't. The Child's Trail was named that because it was so steep in areas that the children had to get off their horse and walk. But you can see the trench in the tundra up on the top on this picture because the Utes used these trails for hundreds of years, back and forth. They didn't stay in the wintertime. They didn't like that snow. They didn't want to camp in it. Well, after the Utes, we had the Arapaho Indian come to the area. Again, they started mostly as a plains-type Indian, but being forced by other tribes to move continually west, they also located what's now the Estes Park area, and they came up and over the top of the mountain to what's now the Cowanachie Valley and the Grand Lake area. And after all, they had this great trail system in place. They just walked where the Utes walked for many, many years. And they went over and came down to this valley and settled in many of the meadows in the valley. The Cowanachie Valley is about 25 miles long, so there was plenty of room for the Ute and Arapaho at the same time. Although there were conflicts, there's several that are fairly well documented now that we document it. Of course, they were legends to both the Ute and the Arapaho. But this is the great Cowanachie Valley. As we move forward in time a little bit, we also had French trappers that came through the area. We've all heard of the French. They were chasing the beaver ponds and trapping the beaver for the hats. Well, the French trappers found this very large river in what's now almost western Colorado, and they called it the Grand River, and they just followed it upstream, following the beaver ponds. Well, eventually they came to the headwaters, and most of us know that our larger river systems have a lake as the headwaters. And so the French kept going and going and going until they found Grand Lake. And that's how Grand Lake got its name, was after the Grand River. And this is the lake that they found. Well, we'll bump forward just a little bit. I know everybody in here has heard this because this is a favorite saying throughout Colorado. Whiskey's for drinking and water is for fighting. Well, in the 1880s, many people, farmers especially, on the eastern plains of Colorado, they would look to the west and they'd see all that white stuff up there and say, you know, there's got to be a way we can get that to melt and irrigate our crops. And so in 1890, they started the Grand River Ditch Project, named after the water that they were taking out of the Grand River Ditch. They started digging a ditch on the side of the mountain range, and they used different ethnicities and different cultures that came through. They had Swedes and Irish and the Japanese. It was interesting. They wouldn't let the Japanese live with any of the others. The Japanese literally dug holes in the side of the mountains to live in, while all the rest of the workers had cabins to stay in, because that's what the cultures called for in 1890. Well, that first 2 years, they dug a total of about 2.5 miles by hand, pick and shovel and a little bit of dynamite, because all of you know, we don't call this the Rocky Mountains for nothing. After several years, they'd had the first section of it done. It was a total of about 7 miles long, and it captured the snowmelt high up on the ridges before it made it down to the Grand River and diverted it north over the Continental Divide and brought it to eastern Colorado. So we now have snowmelt traveling to the Atlantic Ocean because they crossed the Continental Divide with it. Okay. It was very unique. The ditch still operates today. They did it in sections, a total of about 14.5 miles, and it ended in 1935. And this is what the Grand River Ditch looks like today. It is still full of water. It is still bringing water over the Thunder Pass down to the Cache-La Poudre River and down through the Poudre Canyon and out to the plains. A little bit of it's used for drinking water, but most of it is still for irrigation of our crops in eastern Colorado. Just a wonderful program. Yes, that is a road on it. No, you can't drive on that road. It's only open to the water company that owns the Grand River Ditch, and it's their inspection road as they drive up and down. We also had numerous homesteaders in the area. This is just a very partial listing of them. There were well over 150 homesteaders that came to the Kawanichi Valley. And I know most of you are very familiar with the Homestead Act, but actually there were 4 of them. And the one that most people are familiar with is the one that was signed in 1862 by President Lincoln to try and get people to spread out and develop our country in the West. And that was the one that we all hear about. You can have up to 160 acres for free. All you have to do is build a house the first year and then improve the agriculture every year for a total of 5 years. And then you file for your land patent and you own the property. We know there's no such thing as free. Think about the hard work that was involved with those homesteaders, building that cabin in the first year, improving the crops, raising their livestock. You know, less than 50% of homesteads in our nation were never proved up after 5 years. It was too hard to work. These people couldn't get enough rain. Think about the plains. They couldn't get enough rain to raise the crops, to feed their livestock, to pull the plows, to raise more crops. So many people just walked away from it, as many did in the Kawanichi Valley. There were a number of them that did stay. We've got the Pratt family and the Young family and the Quincy's and the Holsworths and the Wiswalls and a number of different families. Well, this is one of the early families that's homesteaded in the Kawanichi Valley. This is the Harbison family. In the middle here, you have Mother seated on the bench, and then her 2 daughters, Annie, who is standing in the back, and Kitty, who's sitting next to her mother, and their younger brother, Rob. But Mother and their father, Andrew, had already had a homestead near the town of Greeley. They, again, did not prove up on it. The Silver Panic of 1893 ended their ranching career, so that it is. And so they moved up to the Grand Lake area. Well, because Mother and Father had had a homestead, the 2 girls filed a homestead. Not unheard of, just very, very unusual for women to file homesteads. Annie was 28 at the time. Kitty was 24. Rob was only 20, or there would have been a 3rd homestead probably, because you had to be 21. Consider yourself head of household, of course. So the 2 girls each homesteaded 160 acres to create the 320-acre Harbison Ranch to start a dairy herd and a dairy operation to supply milk to the townspeople of Grand Lake, just 2 miles down the road. Well, many, many years later, somebody came up to the Harbison girls and said, "You can't raise dairy cattle at 8,900 feet. They won't survive." And they said, "You know, all the work that we've done for the last 28 years, and now you tell us this?" But the Harbison girls were a very interesting story. But if you look closely at the picture, when they first got there, this picture was taken in the summer of 1897. Their homestead was started in 1896. They're all dressed in their nice frills and their bows and their wonderful outfits. But this picture kind of talks a lot about Annie and Kitty. Annie, as I mentioned, standing in the back with her hand on Kitty's shoulders, because they were 4 years apart in age, but very, very close, just like twins. Annie was the life of the party. Look at that big smile. Looking off to the side, big smile on her face. Kitty was much more laid back, very much like her mother. Well, let's take a recipe. Say a recipe, and of course the women were all great cooks, but say a recipe called for 2 eggs. Well, Kitty would normally say, "You know, it'd probably be just as good with 1. Whereas Annie, oh, look at her and you can tell what I'm about to tell you. She'd say, "How much better would it be with 3? These were early homesteaders. They indeed operated the Harbison Dairy Ranch until the passing of the Harbison girls in 1938. They left it to a young lady that they had helped raise, and it continued within the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park until 1954, when the National Park Service finally bought the Harbison Ranch. This was their buildings, some of their buildings. You'll see a very small building in the middle of that, and that was Annie's first cabin. It looks like it was about 12 feet by 16 feet. All 5 of those adults lived there. And the first winter, they're cowing the calf. Because they didn't have a chance to get up early enough in the year to build a barn. They were working on building this cabin in the wintertime. When they walked up from Denver in the 1st of November, Mother and Rob and Annie and their half-brother Harry, who had already been in Grand Lake, they spent 3 days walking from Empire to Grand Lake. I know a lot of you have been to Empire, right there off of Interstate 70. We take an hour and a half and just pop up and over the top of that hill. But they went through 18 inches of snow on top of Berthoud Pass in that trek. And they were walking and dragging a cow and a calf behind them. So the first day they walked to the top of Berthoud Pass. The second day they walked down to the stage stop of basically Coulter, which is about 4 miles south of current-day Granby. And then, of course, that third day they just made that quick last 24 miles up to the ranch. If you're used to walking 14, 15 hours a day, you can probably do that. I couldn't certainly do that today. I know that. Another great homesteader, Squeaky Bob Wheeler. Squeaky Bob came to work the gold mines in the 1880s. The gold was terrible. There were very low quality and terrible quantity. Nobody would come to the Kawanichi Valley to process the ore because there wasn't enough of it. So these gold miners and silver miners were loading up the rocks in a wagon and a team and coming up and over the top of Berthoud Pass 65 miles to Georgetown to have it processed and get, $1.30, $1.40 worth of gold out of it. They were losing money every time they made that trip. Well, Squeaky Bob was one of those gold miners. He left to join the Spanish-American War, but he loved the area. And I know many of you in here say the same thing every time you come to the Grand Lake area. Oh, what would it take for me to live up here? Just buy one of the businesses that's for sale every 2 or 3 years because those people said the same thing. Well, Squeaky Bob said, I know that tourists are starting to ride horseback from now the town of Estes Park up and over the top of the mountain to get to Grand Lake and do some fishing and spend the summer there. I'm going to build a hotel. I'm going to capture them. And so he was at the base of what is now Trail Ridge Road with his hotel, and he called it Camp Wheeler, after Squeaky Bob Wheeler. Squeaky Bob was a well-known cook. I mean, the people in Estes Park said, when you take off on horseback and go up and over the top, you want to stop at Squeaky Bob's because he's a great cook. And he really was, okay? He wasn't so much of a housekeeper. Off to the left of the picture, you'll see what they called a tent cabin, kind of a half tent and half log cabin, okay? And that's where you would stay. You have a meal with Squeaky Bob, looking forward to that home-cooked meal. And after all, you'd been on your horse for a week, so you smelled just like your horse. But now you got to sleep on sheets and a cot. And when you left, Squeaky Bob would go in and he'd turn the sheets over and he'd sprinkle them with a little bit of talcum powder. And then the next guest would leave, and he'd turn the sheets over and sprinkle them with a little talcum powder. And then he'd turn them and sprinkle them and turn them. We honestly don't know how many times Bob Wheeler would turn the sheets over. We do know that once a year he would come down to the town of Grand Lake and hire some women to wash some filthy, dirty sheets in the side of the lake. But that's what hoteling was. You got off your horse. The Colorado River, or the Grand River as it was called then, was right next to Squeaky Bob's place, and you got off your horse. That was a bath. Okay, it was a little chilly, but that was a bath, and you were looking forward to it. So, as well as the good cooking. Many people in the area, when they homesteaded, they brought cattle with them, and they operated a cattle ranch. Well, Johnny Holsworth took just a few years of figuring out how hard work this was because the growing season is very, very short for feed for the cattle. He did what so many did. They went into the tourism business. Again, they created the Holsworth site and called it the Holsworth Trout Lodge. You could show up and Johnny would take you out and catch as many fish as you wanted to eat. 50, 60, it didn't matter. Whatever amount of trout you wanted, Johnny knew where they were. He'd take you on all-day horseback rides, that type of stuff. Because again, they found they could make lots more money off the tourists than they ever thought about making off the cattle. Except Johnny also raised hay that he had planted, Timothy, for the cattle that he had originally, and his father. And he started selling this fine mountain hay to the horse race tracks in Arizona. He was making so much money he could cut it in the Grand Lake area, haul it by wagon. Eventually the train was down at Granby. He'd load it on the train, and they'd haul it to Arizona for him. Made a lot of money doing that, almost as much as he did off the hotels and the trout lodge and stuff like that. For those of you that haven't visited, it's now called the Holsworth Historic Site. They have kept some of the original buildings from 1917, and you can go through these and see what life really was like in the 1920s and 1930s. I really strongly encourage you to go there. It's a wonderful place to revisit history just a little bit. Well, Rocky Mountain National Park. But that wasn't the first name that was suggested for Rocky Mountain National Park. Actually, some people in the Estes Park area, Enos Mills and others, were trying to put together the part that they were going to call a national park. It was going to be fairly small, about 26 miles this way and 45 miles that way, and it was going to be called the Estes National Park. Well, that proposal didn't go very far because somebody said, well, let's make this a bigger national park. You know, we've got Yosemite and we've got the Yellowstone. Let's make this larger. So one of the early proposals was to expand the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park, because it was in the Rockies, to include Pikes Peak. It was going to go from Pikes Peak to the Wyoming border, and it was going to go from Estes to the Utah border. It doesn't do that today. It's still about 400 square miles, so it's big enough for us to all get out and try and find the elusive grizzly bear. Well, I don't want to say anything about Brian's story, but the grizzlies haven't been in Rocky since 1922 is the last reported grizzly bear in the area. We used to have wolves and grizzly bears in Rocky. But you know what? We like to look at our elk, and wolves and grizzly bears chase elk. So we did away with all the wolves and the grizzly because we wanted to see our elk. Here's something for you. Thanks to Bill Hornsby and his book about the 75th anniversary of Club 31, we have found that he did some research back, and these are actually from the minutes of the Denver Rotary Club of January 8th, 1914, when your president made a talk about the gentleman by the name of Enos Mills, who was making these proposals everywhere. Enos Mills wrote over 2,000 letters trying to convince people that we needed a new national park, and the Denver Rotary supported him in that. Okay? Very much so. They supported him so much, as you can see, they made him an honorary member of Club 31. And then later, in April of that same year of 1914, you had a resolution, and there was a motion made to support Estes Park becoming a national park. Estes Park as a national park. Well, that didn't work out. As I mentioned, they did call it the Rocky Mountain National Park, and were appreciative of that. Because the very next year after this resolution was passed, in 1915, Rocky Mountain National Park was established. We did not create Rocky Mountain National Park. We simply gave it a name. In 1915, in 1914, while this was going on with the Rotary, the Arapaho were invited to come back and give us some names of areas that they had known when they were in the area. And so the Colorado Mountain Club went to the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, brought a couple of elders back, and because of their 2-week road trip, we now have 24 peaks in Rocky Mountain National Park that have Arapaho names, and we have many rivers and valleys and features throughout the landscape, including the Kawanichi Valley. That's Arapaho for Coyote Creek, for the river that runs through the middle of the valley. We now know that as the Colorado River. Well, in 1915, as I mentioned, the park was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on January 26, 1915. And everybody knows that January is a great time to have a party in Estes Park. So even then they said, well, maybe not. Nobody's going to show up anyway, so let's not. So they decided to wait until the September of 1915, and September 4th, 1915, they dedicated Rocky Mountain National Park, and it rained off and on all day long. Had a few hundred people there. It was a very well attended. And then in 1926, Rotary International had their conference in Denver. And out of the Rotarian magazine, they had this wonderful ad. Visit Rocky Mountain National Park while you're here for the conference. And I'm not going to read this all to you. You can see it. But just a wonderful advertisement to bring all the Rotarians to the Rocky Mountain National Park. Take that 3-day tour. Leave Denver, take a day to go into Estes, another day to go up and over Estes to Grand Lake, and then a day to come back through Idaho Springs and Denver. Just a wonderful 3-day trip, because that's what it took when you were driving Model Ts through Rocky Mountain National Park. Some things never change, do they? This is the 1950s on top of Trail Ridge Road. Some things don't change, but Congress finally allocated some money in the 1950s and 60s to recondition all of our parks, and now that's replaced by this. Now, this picture must have been taken on an early Sunday morning, because that restroom always still has lines in front of it. Other things change, but they don't. This is how our early rangers patrolled Rocky Mountain National Park. This is Fred McLaren, one of the West Side Rangers, very early in the 1922s. His flat hat is about the only part of the uniform that we still use today. The flat hat has been the National Park hat since 1912. Here's some of our wonderful law enforcement rangers today, a couple of them mounted, but the change is that we now also include women in our law enforcement in our national parks, which I think is just a wonderful thing. But they still patrol the backcountry of Rocky Mountain National Park on horseback, just as Fred McLaren did in 1922. Well, if they're on horseback, what's the primary function of a park ranger on horseback? It's to herd tourists. If you look closely, you're going to see another flat hat in the middle of that picture. She's actually there giving a presentation to the crowd, and the ranger came up behind on horseback. But I just had to show this, because some of my dear friends in the national park are on horseback, and they love this picture, because that's an awful lot of what they do, is herd tourists around. Rocky Mountain National Park. Our centennial, our 100th birthday. Please take advantage of some of the events and opportunities that are around. There are multiple things that you can see and do. Rocky Mountain National Park has a great website with a full calendar of all the events. Most of the events are outside of Rocky, in the communities of Grand Lake and Estes or Loveland or Steamboat Springs or Denver. Please get involved with some of the activities and enjoy our 100th. The theme for our 100th anniversary, wilderness, wildlife, and wonder. I'd like to leave you with a final thought. The past, the present, and the future are all really one. They are today. And that's as relevant as it was 150 years ago when Harriet Beecher Stowe said those words. I would like to challenge all of you to see what you can do to make sure that Rocky Mountain National Park is here another 100 years. Thank you very much.